Ladies and gentlemen, this is proof anything can happen in the World Wrestling Federation. Alright.
Nothing says Christmas more than two oddly shaped men grabbing each other in increasingly strange and exciting ways. We've recently opened the floor for you all to decide what the next episode of Runback should be, and Smackdown 2 nearly edged out Contender 2. Thanks to everyone who took part in that vote. With that settled, it's time for a change of pace on the Runback, as this marks the first wrestling game we'll be covering on the show. Before we get into Smackdown 2 itself, it's worth talking about how the game came together, and that starts with Yuke's. At the time, Yuke's was already establishing itself as a go-to studio for wrestling games, having built the foundation for the original Smackdown just a year earlier. That experience would shape almost every decision made for the sequel. While there isn't a lot of detailed information available about the game's development, what is out there would tell you a lot about why Smackdown 2 feels the way it does. Yuke's was already working on a tight schedule, and that means this wasn't going to be a ground-up sequel. Instead of rebuilding the engine, the team focused on expanding on what already works. A bigger roster, more match types, and a general push for scale across the board. A lot of that came down to timing. The WWF was at the height of the Attitude Era and expectations were high. Yuke's had to capture that larger-than-life energy while still working within the limitations of the PlayStation, which led to some smart reuse of assets and systems. Those decisions came with trade-offs, however, longer loading times and an occasional glitch. But it also allowed Smackdown 2 to deliver an amount of content that was almost unheard of for the genre at the time. Now, full transparency before we go any further, reviewing a wrestling game is kind of an aware space to be in. These games sit somewhere between sports, fighting games, and pure fan service, and there isn't really a clean universal way to evaluate them. So for this Runback, the most comfortable way for us to approach Smackdown 2 is to focus on the gameplay itself and ask a simple question. Does it still hold up as a fighting game? Alright, enough of the backstage interview. Time to hit the ring and pray we don't end up on Botchamania. This is Team Crossbody, and this is Smackdown 2's Runback. Coming back to Smackdown 2, I find the visuals are strange, because my first reaction wasn't admiration or disappointment, it was uncertainty. I couldn't tell immediately what if I was looking at was good for its time, or simply familiar. The character models are chunky and exaggerated, with proportions that fell halfway between realism and a caricature, almost like a bunch of Bob Burger's characters in a way. Faces are stiff, animations could look abrupt, and there's a clear lack of nuance compared to what could be found even a generation later. Some of the face scans don't help with that first impression either. A few wrestlers look less like digital recreations and more like someone pressed their face up against a plate of glass and hit capture. The Rocket particularly ends up looking like he's permanently mid-smashed through a foggy window. It's rough, but also kind of endearing in his own way. Stone Cold looks as if his shoulders and his neck is just one huge bone, and crappy American Badass Undertaker comes off of what I can only describe as shibby. At the same time, those limitations are impossible to separate from the hardware. This is a PlayStation game pushing against the edge of what the system can reasonably do, and it shows. Textures are flat, crowds are repetitive, the arenas rely more on light and color and the detail. From a purely technical standpoint, there's a lot that feels dated, even awkward. Where Smackdown 2 starts to win me over is its presentation. Entrances are simple but deliberate, wrestlers hit their poses, the camera pulls in just enough and the focus stays on the body language rather than the spectacle. There's no cinematic access, but the entrances still feel purposeful, helped by the licensed theme and clear readable animations. It's basic, but it understands what matters. The crowd, while visually limited to the point of visibly seeing a void between them and the barricade, does more work than it probably should. Cameras, flashes, and pop constantly from the stands, creating the flickering sea of lights that sell the idea of a packed arena. Signs are repetitive and low detail, but they fill in that space that reinforce that sense of scale. It all works just well enough as long as you don't go fishing for finer details. The longer I spent with it, the more those rough edges seem to soften. The animations, while limited, are readable and exaggerated in a way to make matches easy to follow. Wrestlers snap into their poses cleanly, strikes are clear, and signature movements are emphasized just enough to sell the impact. There's almost a toy-like quality to the models, and that fits the over-the-top presentation of the Attitude Era. What makes the visuals grow on me is how well they serve the game's rhythm. Nothing feels overly busy or distracting, and sure, that can be easily argued that is due to the hardware of the time, and yes, that's true, but the simplicity helps keep focus on the positioning, timing, and momentum rather than the visual spectacle. In motion, the game communicates what's happening clearly, which matters far more in play than raw fidelity. By the end of my time with Smackdown 2, I still wasn't sure if I called the graphics good in a traditional sense, but I also couldn't call them flat out bad. They're functional, expressive, and strangely charming. Visuals that may not impress at a glance, but steadily earns appreciation through repetition. In that way, Smackdown 2's graphics feel less like a technical achievement and more like an acquired taste. They grow on you, not because they age gracefully, but because they do exactly what they need to do and nothing more. Ultimately, not bad for a bunch of salamander people throwing each other. One of the areas where Smackdown 2 immediately feels confident in is the sound design. Even going back to it now, the game does a surprisingly good job at selling the illusion of a live wrestling event. The crowd noises is loud, reactive, and ever-present, swelling at the right moments and selling into a steady roar during the slow stretches. It doesn't try to be subtle, and it doesn't need to be. Wrestling crowds aren't subtle. What stood out more than I expected is how the in-ring sound effects are handled. Impacts have weight, but they're slightly muted, almost padded, which mirrors how real bumps sound when the body hits the canvas instead of a hard surface. Slams don't crack like gunshots, they thud. Strikes land with enough snap to feel the impact without turning the match into a cartoon. It's a small detail, but it goes a long way towards grounding the action. The entrances and presentation sounds also do a whole lot of the heavy lifting here. The theme music hits cleanly, crowd reaction spikes appropriately, and the overall audio mixing keeps the focus where it should be. Nothing overwhelms anything else, and the game constantly prioritizes atmosphere over raw volume. The original music is where things get a little more interesting. The soundtrack is very much a product of its time, loud, distorted, guitar-driven tracks that fit perfectly alongside the WWF Attitude Era's branding. There's a strong no metal and hard rock influence throughout, and while none of the tracks are especially subtle or complex, they carry the right kind of energy. A few of the songs sounds just familiar enough though to raise an eyebrow. There are riffs and rhythms that feel adjacent to bands like Rage Against the Machine, Early Disturbed, and Pantera. There's a lot of Pantera here. Not direct lifts, but it's close enough that you can hear the inspiration. It's that kind of legally distinctive aggression that was common in licensed adjacent soundtracks at the time, and honestly it works. The music doesn't need to be iconic, it just needs to get you hype, and it does exactly that. With all that being said, the sound design and music reinforces Smackdown 2's identity more than its visuals ever could. The crowd noises, the impact sounds, and the aggressive soundtrack all lock into that same Attitude Era mindset. Much like the graphics, I wouldn't call the audio technically impressive by modern standards, but it's effective enough. It's confident and it's deeply in tune with the game is trying to be. And once you're in the middle of a match, it's hard to imagine it sounding any other way. The only real oddness with the game's music comes from a couple of its menu tracks, which I'm not gonna sugarcoat it for y'all. Sounds like something you'd hear in a old folks retirement home porn video. Don't get me wrong, I love it.
and that's probably more due to Stockholm Syndrome than good taste at this point. Still, it definitely sticks out. I guess that's just what happens when an American-made wrestling product is being filtered through a Japanese development team. The result is this strange, slightly off-kilter vibe that doesn't quite match the Attitude Era aggression, but somehow becomes part of the game's charm anyway. Smackdown 2 is absolutely packed with game modes, which is the core reason why we chose to cover it over the original. It's essentially that game, but turned up to 100. While most of the modes aren't exactly groundbreaking, you've got your standard exposition mode, and a handful of creation suites like Create a Superstar, Pay-Per-View, Taunt, Stable, and Manager. The real focus is where Yuke's clearly was pushing the hardest: Season Mode.
Season mode is where the game really justifies its existence. This is the area where Ukes clearly looked at the first game and said, yeah, that's not enough. If Smackdown felt like the proof of concept, Smackdown 2 is a version where they clearly tried to see how far they can push it. The biggest addition is skill. Season mode isn't just a straight line anymore, it's a web. You're not just grinding through match after match, you're getting pulled into feuds, tag teams, title pictures, and random nonsense that depends on who you play and how things shake out. Wins matter, losses matter, and sometimes neither of those things matter at all because wrestling logic is wrestling logic. That unpredictability is both the mode's greatest strength and its biggest flaw. On the plus side, it does a generally good job of capturing that chaotic feeling of Attitude Era WWF. 1 week you're chasing after a singles title, the next you're suddenly in a tag team you didn't ask for, and that all somehow feels believable within the context of late 90s wrestling TV. But the cracks begin to show the longer you stay in it. A lot of the story beats are clearly modular and reused, which means you'll start seeing familiar scenarios pop up across different seasons and wrestlers. Betrayals repeat, authority figures lose their minds in the same way. The surprise becomes less surprising once you've seen the gears turning. Another major addition is how many characters the season mode tries to juggle at once. The roster size alone is wild for a PS1 game, and season mode actually attempts to make use of it. That's impressive, but it also means the focus gets spread thin. Some wrestlers feel central to the universe, while others just drift in and out with little fanfare, which can make certain runs feel a little undercooked. There's also the technical side of things. The ambition here pushes the PlayStation hard, and you feel it in the long load times and occasional glitches. And the general sense is that the game is holding itself together with duct tape and good intentions. None of this is a deal breaker, but it's part of the experience. Still, when it works, it really works. Season mode gives Smackdown 2 a sense of identity that goes just beyond having a collection of matches. It feels alive in a way the first game quite never managed. Even when it's messy, repetitive, or outright weird, there's always a sense that something could happen next. Ukes didn't just add more to season mode, they made it the backbone to the game. And while it's far from perfect, that ambition is exactly why Smackdown 2 is remembered so fondly. It's flawed, chaotic, and occasionally frustrating, but it's the closest the series ever got to capturing that feeling of watching weekly WWF TV and thinking, yeah, anything could happen.
And that's the bottom line, 'cause Stone Cold said so.
Hey, hold on to your seats.
As primary fighting game players, it's hard to look at the gameplay of something like Smackdown 2 and not immediately consider which mechanics we like or dislike within the genre at large. With that being said, as we stated at the top of the video, wrestling game developers have to honor at least 3 core aspects for the game to truly work: being a believable sports game, having satisfying fighting mechanics, and deliver on fan service. Without properly representing the sport, why even make the wrestling game in the first place? Without interesting and satisfying core fighting mechanics, the game would get boring very fast. And underperforming in the fan service won't properly reflect the product the game is trying to emulate. While some wrestling games may lean more heavily on certain pillars than others, all of them need to be fulfilled to some extent for a wrestling game to be considered good, in our book. With that being said, are wrestling games even acknowledged as fighting games? Yes and no. Kind of a lame answer, I know, but it's true. Once again, there's quite a bit of overlap from time to time. Nothing too intense, but a seasoned player of the genre can easily point out either, assuming their head isn't too far up their ass. Things like frame traps, oki, whiff punishment, mix-ups are all still present. Some of these principles are clearly intended by the developers, while others absolutely aren't. It also depends on the type of wrestling game we're talking about. Mechanics and pacing in something like the Ike engine titles feel closer to a wrestling simulator, with emphasis on complex grapple systems that constantly push the wrestlers to get into a lock-up situation to perform those moves. This contrasts heavily with the Yuke's engine games, which lean far more to an arcade style, close enough to wrestling to recognize, but disjointed from reality to let the characters perform some pretty stupid stuff. These games are less about the sheer number of moves a wrestler can perform, and more about delivering fast, fluid matches that are easy to pick up and play.
Smackdown 2's combat is built around one core idea: keep the match moving at all costs. Sometimes this works in his favor, other times it feels like the game is physically allergic to downtime. Either way, everything, controls, mechanics, pacing, is designed to push you forward whether you're ready or not. At a fundamental level, and I guess that would be max difficulty for Smackdown's 2 controls, it's really simple. You gotta strike, grapple, block, and a run. That's it. There's no complex inputs, no execution barriers, nowhere timing windows to memorize. If you can hold down a direction and press a button, congratulations, you're already playing Smackdown 2 correctly, or at least as correctly as Smackdown 2 allows. Strikes are your primary way of applying pressure and keeping momentum. They're quick, easy to chain, and good for annoying opponents. You can knock people down, stun them into a groggy state, and if you land something clean enough, can even combo directly into a grapple. They're useful, but not especially deep. But they don't need to be. Their job is to keep things moving. They're just blunt tools to smash your opponent with and to help mix up offense between grapple attempts. Blocking exists. It's a pretty miserable defensive option once you actually look at how it functions. While it does stop incoming strikes, most attacks leave the defender stuck in a ton of block stun. So much of it in fact that you're never really going to get a punish afterwards. Instead of rewarding things like good timing and patience, blocking just locks you into place and hands momentum right back to the attacker. In practice, this means that even wildly unsafe offense often goes unpunished. Someone can be mashing strings right into your guard and still act first when it's all said and done. One of the only things you can consistently kinda get a punish on is the occasionally badly spaced dropkick, or something equally committal. And even then that feels less intentional counterplay and more like the game accidentally letting you have a turn. As a result, blocking ends up being less about defense and more about briefly delaying the inevitable while you wait for a better option to open up. You can always try to dash out of the way of attacks and use those to punish strikes more reliably, and to be fair, it works better than blocking in a vacuum. The problem with dashing is that it comes with a noticeable chunk of end lag, which usually gives your opponent just enough time to recover and wiggle away before you can actually capitalize. So even when you make the right read, the game doesn't always let you turn that into real momentum. Running is where the game's obsession with speed becomes almost impossible to ignore. Running attacks, Irish whips, running into turnbuckles, full speed sprints across the ring, Smackdown 2 loves running. Sometimes this creates fun, fast-paced sequences, other times you're just hurling yourself into corners of the ring, trying to land that 50th running neck breaker, because you will be seeing tons and tons of running net breakers, man. Grappling is where most of the real damage gets done, and there's a grapple for pretty much every situation: standing, grounded, near the ropes, running, under the ropes, in between the ropes, in the corner, you name it, there's always a reason to awkwardly extend your arms in that strange universal hugging motion. Directional inputs change the type of grapple you get, but the move pools themselves aren't especially large. This isn't about expression or creativity, it's about getting your opponent into the right position so you can pull off your wrestler's most devastating attack, and hope it's not another roll-up pin attempt. All this feeds into the game's special system: beat up your opponents, keep pressure, don't slow down, and your Smackdown meter will fill up. Once it's ready, all you need to do is get into the correct position and hit L1 where the giant Smackdown icon shows up. It's the game's polite way of saying, alright, this is going on long enough, please perform your finisher and move on. Taking it all in, Smackdown 2's fundamentals do exactly what they're meant to do. Strikes keep pressure high, running keeps up the pace, grapples drive most of the damage, and the special system makes sure things don't drag on too long while giving you something to work towards. It's a system built around constantly moving forward. Effective, flashy, rarely deep. The downside is that once you're on the receiving end, your options shrink fast. Blocking stalls you, movement resets things at best, and positioning matters more for offense than defense. So when the game gives you a way to consistently take your turn back, it ends up carrying a lot of the weight. Which brings us to the reversals and counters.
When we first jump back into the game, we notice it seems to be built around a simple rock, paper, scissors idea. Strikes should beat grapples, grapples should beat blocks, and blocks should beat strikes. On paper, it's neat and clean, a logical backbone for any fighting system. In practice though, the reality is messier. Timing quirks, animation priorities, and context-sensitive interactions often throw the whole thing off. So what should be a straightforward triangle ends up feeling unpredictable. So this is where reversals come in. By hitting the block button at the right time during pretty much any offense, you will trigger a reversal. And honestly, it feels like you can wiggle out of almost anything, which is way more impressive than I remember, even if it occasionally turns matches into flu-blown reversal slap fights. You'll be seeing tons of reversals in this game, to the point where it can get a little frustrating, especially when you're just trying to pick up a downed opponent to get them into that all-important groggy state for a finisher. So yeah, reversals are a really strong defensive option, and while you can get a feel for the timing on certain moves, it will still end up feeling pretty random a lot of the time. Well, imagine our shock when we figured out you can actually force a reversal by holding block and tapping a direction, which in this case is probably more accurate to call it a counter. What's interesting here is that it isn't as free as doing a normal reversal, because putting your wrestler into a counter stance immediately drops their guard for a couple of seconds, giving your opponent a window to take advantage of you instead. It's not exactly hard to guess that a typical singles match in Smackdown 2 revolves around 48 minutes of knocking each other around, throwing reversals left and right, intentional or not, with the match usually ending wherever someone lands their finisher. Counters though do slow the game down a bit. Now that both players know that there's a more consistent way to flip momentum in their favor, you'll start approaching situations with a bit more care. Instead of immediately going for an eye rake and grabbing your opponent, risking a reversal, you can bait a counter and let them whiff, and then follow up with a nearly risk-free opportunity. I'm not saying this turns Smackdown 2 into a tournament fighter or anything, but it's nice to see the devs include this hint of meta here, keeping both players who interact with this system brains engaged in the moment-to-moment gameplay. It doesn't provide a ton of depth, but it isn't meant to, but at least there's a little room for skill expression, and I can get behind that, especially considering Smackdown's obsession with keeping things simple.
Another interesting and somewhat unknown mechanic, albeit probably more well known than counters, involves a Smackdown meter. In a typical match, assuming the rules aren't altered, a single finisher, depending on what it is usually enough to end the match via KO, provided your opponent has taken enough damage. Here's the twist. You can actually spend some of your own super meter to no-sell your opponent's signature move. Now, I'm not talking about this negating the damage entirely, but it does at least prevent a knockout from ending the match, which keeps you in the game a little longer. This adds a simple bit of meter management into the mix, which is surprisingly interesting, especially because both the counter stance and this no-sell mechanic aren't explicitly mentioned in the manual or anywhere else from where I've seen. It's just one of those little hidden layers that reward players for exploring the game a little deeper.
Once again, even with the counter and no-sell systems, Smackdown 2 is far from a complicated game. Sure, reversals can feel chaotic at times, and the meter mechanics aren't fully explained, but none of that ever gets in the way of the fun. The fighting system is fast and fluid, matches move quickly, combos flow naturally, and the constant back and forth can create plenty of cool and sometimes unpredictable moments. It almost feels like a sandbox where both players are improvising in real time, and it's not a very good sandbox without a few toys to play with. That's my crappy attempt at leading to a couple of match types. And since Smackdown 2 has a ton of them, we're just going to talk about the ones that are to the rules or the gameplay in a significant way. First up, we got the standard tag team match. There's not a whole lot different here outside of having a partner you can tag in. One slight annoying quirk is that when your opponent tags in their partner, you're still locked into the previous wrestler, and you have to kind of jankily shuffle through targets until you can find the active guy. Miss it, and you have to do it all over again. This can lead to a few cheap shots if you're fumbling, but honestly it's not a huge deal. Overall, the match type works fine. Next up is the Fatal 4-Way, along with its many variations. For this one we played Falls Count Anywhere, which is obviously designed to be chaotic, where a single pinfall decides the winner. Once again, thanks to the awkward targeting system, you'll probably find it easier just to focus on one guy at a time, but there were still a few cool moments with quick improvised double teams. While we're on the topic, it's worth noting that certain match types let the action spill far beyond the ring. You gain access to tons of backstage areas, even the WWF shop zone or whatever it's called. Look, we didn't intentionally put 4 women into the kitchen to fight. We don't know the layout to the stage and it just kinda happened that way. It was pretty hilarious once we noticed though. The casket match I thought would be more exciting. Just beat the guy up and throw him into the casket. How was this the Sinister match in The Undertaker? How can you be the best at just throwing a guy into something? Finally, we've got Hell in a Cell, the newest match type added to Smackdown 2. I get how brutal these matches can be in real life, but the game's interpretation of the situation is a bit underwhelming. Outside of the occasional roof spot, it plays like a standard singles match. The cage itself doesn't come into play much, except for knocking out one of the sides and maybe using it as a weapon. I guess it isn't that bad for a first attempt, but it's not exactly living up to the chaos you expect from a real Hell in a Cell match.
Of course, Smackdown 2 isn't without its quirks, and one of the biggest issues comes in the form of its speed. Wrestlers just move a little too fast. Every match ends up feeling like it's a middle to cruiserweight range, no matter who you're actually playing. You've got massive guys like Viscera who should be lumbering around the ring, exploiting their power, and yet he still moves just as quickly as someone like Grandmaster Sexy. It's pretty silly to watch, and it can make matches feel a little less grounded, even though the chaos is kinda fun. Sure, all this can be explained away with the game's attention-oriented design. It's built for fast, fluid action over realism, but that doesn't stop some of the animations and physics from looking a bit absurd at times. When the roster is full of gargantuan, mirror-flipping superstars all moving at breakneck speeds, it just makes everyone feel the same. The way the damage is decided feels completely all over the place. Wrestlers don't really sell moves until way later in the match. You can powerbomb someone and they'll bounce right back up and roll away the second their backs hit the mic like nothing happened. Early on, everything feels weightless, which makes it hard to tell if you're actually making progress. There were plenty of matches where it felt like full-on squashes the entire time. One wrestler getting dominated, eating everything, and still kicking out of every pin attempt. Then once momentum finally shifts, the wrestler who took way less damage all match suddenly loses after 2 pinning attempts. It's wild. The flow of damage and momentum just doesn't always line up with what's happening on the screen. And that makes me wonder if characters have different healths or if there's some kind of underdog mechanic going on. It's super strange. Another issue that becomes pretty apparent the longer you play is just how many moves are shared across the roster. There's a lot of repetition between superstars, and while sure, there aren't exactly a million different ways to do a suplex, Smackdown 2 somehow manages to make everyone do it the exact same way, same animation, same timing, same everything. After a while, wrestlers start to blur together once the bell rings. This is especially noticeable with the Divas, man, where most of them feel like straight up copies of each other. And I'm not trying to say that people at Ukes are sexist, but come on, man. I know Divas aren't like the most popular thing, but they're literally clones of each other. Same moveset, same flow, barely anything to distinguish one from another outside of the character model. It makes picking different wrestlers feel less meaningful than it should, especially in the game built around a huge roster and fan recognition. It's hard not to chalk all this up to rush development. Smackdown 2 was trying to pack a massive amount of content in a relatively short time span, and something had to give. Unique animations and a deeper move variety were probably the first to get the axe. And that doesn't completely ruin the experience, but it does add to the overall feeling that the game values speed and quantity over individuality.
So, how does Smackdown 2 Know Your Role hold up under more critical and admittedly unique eyes? Well, it's far from a bad game as you can get, and that's worth making absolutely clear up front. For the time of its release, it's exactly the game it needed to be. It achieved what it set out to do, and it deserved the praise and accolades it received over the years. That being said, as we played it, It was hard to shake the feeling that a lot of what makes Smackdown 2 good exists at a very surface level. The graphics are good, at least at first glance, but the more you look at it, the more you start noticing the shortcuts taken to get there. The game looks impressive, but it doesn't always hold up under scrutiny. There's also a lot of replay value, sure, if you're just listing features in a menu. A large roster? Okay. But a good chunk of that roster shares the same moves and animations, and in the few cases of select groups, they're basically straight up clones of one another, and inflates the numbers without actually adding variety where it matters. The gameplay is fast and open, and that part generally works, but it's also very simple and sometimes to a fault. Systems that feel like they should be more defined, like a basic triangle of offense and defense, are mostly suggested rather than fully realized. They're in there in theory, but not always in practice. To me, it feels like the developers made a game that's extremely inviting and easy to enjoy, as long as you don't stick around too long in the same room with it. It's fun, it's accessible, it's flashy, but the cracks start to show once you slow down and really dig into how it all fits together. To all of our TCB faithful, have a happy and safe Christmas, and we'll see you next time on the Runback.
Buddy. All right.